get started. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the first Skeptical Inquirer Presents of the year. That is 2025. If you're new around these parts, Skeptical Inquirer Presents is a series of live online presentations from experts who are devoted to advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. I'm your host, Leanne Lord. I'm an award-winning stand-up comedian, author, and much to my dismay, human. My petition to be Vulcan was once again denied at Starfleet Academy. Congratulations to anyone with the fortitude to be doing dry January. No one would blame you if you stopped right now and resumed in January 2029. I think the real winners here are the folks who are celebrating National CBD Month. But that's 3 letters, so maybe that's been canceled as well. Tonight, we are having a conversation with one of our favorite returning guests, Dr. Paul Offit, who basically held our hand and kept us informed on several episodes of Skeptical Inquirer Presents during the pandemic. In addition to his hand-holding skills, he's a professor of pediatrics at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's the author of several books, including Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine, Bad Advice, or Why Celebrities, Politicians, and Activists Aren't Your Best Source of Health Information, and the very soon to be released, Tell Me When It's Over, an insider's guide to deciphering COVID myths and navigating our post-pandemic world. Now, tonight, we're having a conversation about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s confirmation to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and what it could mean for the American healthcare system. And to be clear, our CSI fellow, Dr. Paul, is going to be talking, and I'm going to be listening, mostly. Now, when RFK Jr.'s nomination was announced, public health advocates around the country began sounding the alarm. The Center for Inquiry called him wholly unqualified and manifestly unfit. In the weeks since, Dr. Paul has emerged as one of the go-to experts for reporters and analysts covering Kennedy's nomination and looking to understand just how much trouble we might be in if he's confirmed. Now, for those of you who are joining us live, and thank you so much for being here, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. But Dr. Paul will be discussing the importance of HHS and the many programs it oversees when it comes to protecting public health, pandemic preparedness, and promoting life-saving science. He'll also explain the devastating impact a single individual such as RFK Jr. could have if he's put in charge, and why it's important for Americans everywhere, even the potential ones in Greenland and Canada, to oppose his nomination. And so, Dr. Paul Offit, welcome back to Skeptical Inquirer Presents.
Thank you, Leanne. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
It's good to see you. Thank you always for taking the time to be here with us. Now I want to start off with something real simple. Now, besides it being hard to say it 3 times fast, what is HHS?
So it's Health and Human Services. It's
okay.
A huge government agency. It has a budget of $1.85 trillion. It has 80,000 employees. And HHS supervises the Food and Drug Administration. It supervises the National Institutes of Health. It supervises the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the USDA, Department of Agriculture. So it's a big organization that has everything to do with at least trying to keep us healthy.
Okay, so a little important to everybody. Who was the head of it and who's running it now? I mean, is there nobody there? Is just an acting head of?
It's Becerra. Becerra is currently the head of it.
Okay. And I know that they haven't even scheduled the nomination hearings yet.
No, they just did actually.
They did?
Just today, yeah.
So okay, it was today.
He's going to appear before his confirmation. It consists of 2 committees. Next Wednesday, January 29th, he will appear before the Finance Committee. And then the following day, January 30th, he will appear before the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, Pension. So just got announced, hot off the press.
Okay, okay. I've been managing my news intake today, so my apologies for not being completely up on that. I was distracted by the World Health Organization. Wait, what? Didn't we found that? How can we leave?
Oh, it shows you. It's like, what does the World Health Organization offer us? It offers us an overview of what's going on in the world. I mean, you need the World Health Organization, especially for things like coronavirus pandemics, right? We've just had our third one in the last 20 years. I mean, they let you know what's going on with Ebola, dengue, Zika. I mean, it's when Robert F. Kennedy Jr., for example, says, I think the United States, should give infectious diseases a break for 8 years and just focus on chronic diseases. I can tell you infectious diseases aren't going to be giving us a break.
Why the binary? Because I that was a question I was going to ask, and I've heard him say this, or it said about him. Why the binary? Like, we're going to stop looking at infectious diseases and do chronic diseases as if they're not both important. Like, why is that a thing for him?
Excuse me. He believes that we have simply traded in infectious diseases for chronic diseases, that by giving vaccines the way that we've given them over the last couple hundred years, and that by either eliminating or dramatically reducing infectious diseases, that has caused chronic diseases, that these things that we've been given, like vaccines or antibiotics, he views them all as sort of toxins. And therefore, that's why we have to stop doing that. If you really want to scare yourself, you should read this book, The Real Anthony Fauci, but don't read it. So what I can make it easy for you, just read pages 285 to 291, where you will learn that RFK Jr. does not believe in the germ theory. He doesn't. He doesn't believe that specific germs cause specific diseases and that the prevention or treatment of those germs is a life-saving measure. Rather, he believes in the miasma theory. And you can hear this when you hear him talk, or you hear like the Surgeon General in Florida, Joseph Ladapo, talk, or you hear sort of the means, Kaylee Means and the Casey Means. This is what they're alluding to. So the miasma theory, for those of you who may not have been in Europe in the
I was
1700s,
going to ask, since I skipped that class in medical school.
so in the miasma theory, which was sort of born in Europe in the 1700s, was the notion that when you sort of put garbage on the streets and there was organic matter that rotted, it released this bad air or miasma into the atmosphere, which then sort of exposed you to all kinds of diseases, which you could avoid by just having a healthy immune system. He believes that. He believes that if you just have a healthy immune system, that you're not going to get any of these diseases. And he will say things like, as long as you're healthy, as long as you eat good foods and you exercise and you pay attention to your metabolism, that you're not going to get these diseases, which makes me think he has never spent one day in a United States hospital, because certainly you can be perfectly healthy and come into our hospital and die. And so that's why he says things like, there is no vaccine that's a benefit. There is no vaccine that's safe and effective. That the polio vaccine killed many, many, many more people than it saved. If you looked on his website, Children's Health Defense, it doesn't list polio as a virus. At least it didn't. It's listed as a toxin. He sees these things, vaccines, antibiotics, as toxins. That's why he drinks unpasteurized milk, because he doesn't think pasteurization really makes it, puts you at lesser risk.
Okay, that was a lot. that real that came at me high speed. Okay, let's take a step back. How did we get here with someone like that being the nominee? I mean, he's not a doctor, correct?
Right. He's an
How-
environmental lawyer.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't understand. Like, how is he the guy? It,
Because
it, it, is it the sexual assault allegations? Because that seems to be what distinguishes most of these nominees.
distinguishes them. I think it's like a quality for getting in, right?
There you go.
I think some a reporter asked me recently, did I think that his nomination or his hiring for that spot, Secretary of Health and Human Services, would sort of cause us to lose trust in that agency. I think that the opposite is true. I think the reason that someone like him is considered is because we've lost trust. I think we've lost trust in public health agencies, which is why you see somebody like Marty McCary being nominated for head of National Institute, head of FDA, or you see Jay Bhattacharya as head of NIH, or Dave Weldon as head of CDC. All of those people have one thing in common. They have disdain for the agencies that they're being asked to lead. They think that those agencies have led us astray, and they're going to come in there, they're going to pull back the curtain, find all this bad stuff, and reveal it to the American public. Because according to RFK Jr., we have far more chronic diseases than we ever had, and it's these public health agencies that are responsible for that. And he's going to turn that all around by just basically bringing people in who are going to just turn those places upside down. It's a frightening time. Look at what's happening. I mean, you have, aside from withdrawing from the WHO, you have an edict by the Trump administration that there can be no communications right now from these public health agencies, where they've put a pause on NIH granting meetings. And so it's a frightening time to be a scientist right now in this country.
For everyday folks, what does that mean? When you say there's a pause, like they can't communicate? Are we talking with other agencies, or communicating with the people who need this information? What does that mean?
It
And
means communicating to the public. So
to
for
the
example,
public?
let's go frozen. So there's three, the CDC communicates through a journal called Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. There are three that were ready to come out that they just paused on. So no, you can't do it. It has to go through us, and we're not going to have any communications from the public health agency, because this is an outcome of COVID. I think this is an outcome of what happened in the COVID pandemic, which is that many people saw the things that happened in 2020 and 2021 as massive government overreach, that the government went way too far, and we need to push back. And I'll give you an example. So in 2020, when COVID came into the United States and was killing hundreds or thousands of people a day, we didn't have anything. We didn't have antivirals until October. We didn't have monoclonal antibodies till November. We didn't have vaccines till December. All we had was trying to avoid human-to-human contact with a virus that could be spread asymptomatically, meaning anybody you come in contact with could transmit a virus that could kill you. And so we just had to avoid human-to-human contact, which meant we shuttered schools, we closed businesses, we restricted travel, we masked, we isolated, we distanced, we tested, and that really upset a lot of people. They thought that was government overreach. And then again in 2021, when we mandated vaccines, and you couldn't get into your favorite bar or restaurant or sporting event or place of worship unless you had your vaccine card, that too was seen as massive overreach. And I think this is the backlash from that. We leaned into a libertarian left hook, and this is what happens when you get hit.
I wish we were, I guess, adult enough not to follow the pendulum swing. Do you know what I mean? It's like we go to extremes here, like we, as you said, the libertarian punch that we leaned into. There is there no middle ground?
Well, we elected a president who is now representing that point of view. Do I think it's the mainstream point of view? No, but I think it is a vocal minority point of view, a loud minority point of view. And so that's what you're saying. I think most people believe that vaccines are a good thing. But you're seeing massive pushback. I mean, not just with COVID vaccines. The CDC reported, when they still could report things, that the vaccine exemption rate among kindergartens is the highest it's ever been. And as a consequence, they said correctly, we're losing herd immunity. So in 2023, we had about 5,900 cases of pertussis. In 2024, we had 32,000. That's much greater than pre-pandemic levels. In 2023, we had about 58 cases of measles. In 2024, we had 290 cases of measles with 16 outbreaks. We're not going in the right direction, and I think this is only going to get worse in this administration.
Are these the parents that are they all anti-vax, or are they just afraid? Are they victims of bad information? Because I was surprised that small percentage of not doing it could be such a huge thing, like 95%. Oh, that still sounds like it's good. And I am shocked that that 5% is what can move the needle to herd immunity to not herd immunity.
Well, especially measles. I mean, measles is the most contagious of the vaccine preventable diseases. There's something called the reproducibility index or infectiousness index, if you will, contagiousness index, which is to say, if you are sick with something, let's say COVID, and then you go about your normal day, you're not masked, and you meet the number of people you would normally meet, assuming they're all susceptible, you'll infect 2 to 4 people a day. With measles, the number is 18.
Ooh,
That's the one that's going to come roaring back, that's what really scares me the most. But this is the zeitgeist. I think the zeitgeist is kind of science denialism. So when you have somebody like RFK Jr., although most normal people would look at that and say, "What the hell are you doing?" This is the man who said no vaccine is a benefit. This is the guy who's going to head HHS, but he's representative of the zeitgeist.
okay, this is a dark question. Are we just going to have to get to a place where people die? Where we are going to lose people because of this, because of someone like him, because of this, as you say, zeitgeist right now.
Yes, and I think measles is the example. The mortality rate of measles is roughly 0.1%, so about 1 per 1,000 people die. Get to a few thousand cases of measles, and you'll see children die. I was in Philadelphia in 1991. We're in a 3-month period. We had one of the biggest measles epidemic, I think, in the United States history in the vaccine era, when we had 1,400 cases of measles and 9 deaths actually in our city in a 3-month period, and it was a war zone. People were scared to come into the city. They didn't want to come into the city. We vaccinated down to 6 months of age because those who were dying were especially the youngest babies. It was a nightmare. And I just don't think people realize how sick or dead measles can make you.
I'm in the generation that got all my shots. It wasn't a question. And I think you've got at least 2 or 3 generations of people that don't know what true illness looks like. No, the people who had polio are so much older than us, the ones who are left. And so that reality just doesn't hit. Do you know what I mean? It's like you think you've always had it this good in terms of not being sick or not having certain diseases. So it's going to stay that way. But now if I'm understanding what you're saying and what's happening now, we're going to turn to where we're going to regress and not have that. And that's terrifying. Quick question, because I am going to jump into some of the folks that we have here
Sure.
putting questions in the comments. Forgive my ignorance. Can adults get measles?
Of course, adults can get measles and die from measles. You're actually 10 times more likely to get pneumonia and die from measles as an adult than a child. All the more reason to get vaccinated. But there were the same thing's true with chickenpox. There used to be parties where people would try and get infected before there was a vaccine as a child because you're less likely to die as a child. But no, you're more likely to die as an adult.
Wow. Okay. I just, in my head, these are childhood things because I got the shots for them as a child. So again, forgive my ignorance. And I asked that question for anybody who didn't know, like I didn't. All right. Now this is the portion where my vanity gives way to practicality. And in order to read the micro sans serif font, Zoom insists on using. Eugene Kelly, I hope you don't mind me saying your name, wants to know, so why do we have so much more chronic disease if the various agencies are effective in their purpose? That doesn't, oh, I'm going to let you answer that.
Yeah, and so this is RFK Jr.'s point. I mean, he keeps saying we have far more chronic diseases than we used to. So I'm not sure what chronic diseases he's talking about. I think what he's talking about generally is autism, because that's often what he goes back to. Certainly, we are more obese than many other nations. We certainly have a greater incidence of type 2 diabetes. We certainly get much less bang for our healthcare buck, no doubt about it. I mean, we spend more money, arguably per capita, than most other developed world nations, yet we're way down on the list in terms of infant mortality and longevity, all true. That has a lot to do with lifestyle. Also, we do live longer. I mean, vaccines have caused us to live about 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago. So we get to live longer to develop those chronic diseases. It was easier when you died at age 50. I think that's all part of it. But certainly, and I think the healthcare system in many ways has failed us. Don't get me wrong. But vaccines aren't an example of that failure.
Mm-hmm. So So it's not the agencies, it's real, is it life, it's life, so what I'm hearing, it's lifestyle, it's choices, it's living longer, which exposes you to more things. It's not.
No, I like that. There's one New Yorker cartoon which I love. It's two cavemen sitting around a fire, and one says to the other one, "I don't get it. I mean, our water's pure, our air's clean, all our animals are free range, and none of us live past 30."
Wow. Okay. Um, I'm going to read this in real time. I hope it is a decent question. In your opinion, is there any chance that RFK Jr. would work to rescind the approval and availability of any existing or new vaccine?
That he would work to extend the approval. Is that what you mean?
No, that he would work to rescind
Oh,
the approval.
yes. Let me be clear. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. believes that vaccines are hurting our children. He tells you that. He says, when I go on a hiking trail or a running trail and I see a parent holding a child, this is his words. I go up to that parent and I say, don't vaccinate this child. And when I say that, I feel I have saved that child. He's a believer. He's a zealot. It's like, let's say, for example, I believe that there was an environmental toxin that was hurting our children or killing our children. And then you made me the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. I can promise you, I would do everything I could to get that toxin out of there or find a way to lessen its impact or neutralize it. That's how he feels about vaccines. It's what he's been saying for the last 20 years. So when he says, I'm not anti-vaccine, I'm not going to ban vaccines, don't believe him. I think what he could do a lot of things. For example, I'm on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. If we recommend authorization or licensure for a vaccine and the FDA accepts it, he could say, I don't think it's been studied enough. He could say the same thing if the CDC recommends a vaccine. He could say the Vaccine for Children's program, which funds about 50 to 55% of all vaccines in this country, that's given mainly to children who are uninsured or underinsured. He could it's a federal program, it's a congressional program, but he could say, look, this state can't get that vaccine until they remove their school vaccine mandates. Or he could take a vaccine or two out of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program and just let it suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous civil litigation, which is where we were in the early 80s when we went from 18 companies that made vaccines to 4 companies that made vaccines within a period of about 10 years, because it wasn't worth it for these companies to stay in the vaccine business. Realize vaccines are a fragile market. They're not something you give every day. They're something you give just a few times in your lifetime. They're never going to compete with, products like lipid lowering agents, diabetes drugs, psychological drugs, lifestyle products, drugs that you take every day. They can easily be jettisoned by these companies, and I don't think people realize how fragile this is.
Okay, so what is he basing this on? If he truly believes this, based on what evidence?
Yeah, good question.
Oh, okay, I got it. I won. Ding,
He
ding,
just sort
ding.
of makes it up. He believes it, and so he tries to find ways to fit things into his belief system. He'll say the polio vaccine has killed many, many, many more people than it saved, he was born in 1954. This is around the time I was born. We were born in the pre-polio vaccine era. I remember polio, and so does he, I'm sure. But yet he's able to say something like that because of that vaccine, which prevented a disease that at that time in the 50s would cause 30,000 cases of paralysis and about 1,800 deaths a year, that by 1979 was eliminated from this country. What is he talking about? He just makes it up and he just keeps saying these things that are outlandish.
Yeah, it must be nice to be a Kennedy, I guess. I need a bootlegger great grandfather. So based on that question, this is a dark turn. Would RFK Jr. decide that poultry and eggs from flocks known to be infected with bird flu be allowed to be sold at market? Like intentionally infecting people?
Okay, so that's a good question. Bird flu is a complicated subject. So
okay,
here's what I would say. The over the last 20 years, there's been about 1,000 cases of bird flu in roughly 24 countries, with a mortality rate of roughly 50%. This is a high mortality rate. Now, the reason the people who die from that virus are people who've come in contact with birds, because the virus can reproduce itself in the upper respiratory tract of birds. And if you inhale enough to get it down into your lungs, you can then have serious and occasionally fatal pneumonia. But that virus does not replicate or reproduce itself in the upper tract of humans. It doesn't. And it hasn't learned to bind to the receptor that lines our nose, throat, and windpipe, the so-called alpha-2/6 receptor. It hasn't learned to bind to that yet. And it may never. So it may never be a human pandemic. The question about, say, drinking milk that is unpasteurized, say from a cow who is infected with the virus, because it can infect actually the cow's udder. That's actually what it doesn't affect the cow's respiratory tract, which is that the cows aren't really that sick. It's just the udders that get infected. And also, by the way, it can bind to the lining of our eyes, which is why you see conjunctivitis with birds.
Oh, okay.
So the question is, if you eat say a cooked egg, or you drink unpasteurized milk from from a cow that has bird flu, this is an envelope virus. You don't really acquire it by eating it. You acquire it by inhaling it. So we have things in our mouth and stomach like acids and proteases, enzymes that break down proteins, that I think would make it very unlikely that you could get bird flu by ingesting it. I think you would really have to inhale it. Like that man who died in Louisiana, he came in contact with a sick chicken, and he inhaled a lot of the virus, got down into his lower respiratory tract, and killed him. Normally, when you're infected with flu, and you're infected with flu every year, the virus reproduces itself in the upper respiratory tract, amplifies itself, then spreads to the lower respiratory tract. That takes time. 7 days, 10 days, sometimes 14 days to get severely ill. That's actually enough time for your immune system to start to kick in. But if you inhale a lot of virus immediately down into your lungs, you don't have that time. And that's why it can be so highly fatal. But remember, there's 16 different types of flu, all based on the hemoglobin, the H protein, right? H1, H2, H3, bird flu, H5. Only 3 have ever caused pandemics in human history. Okay, H1, H2, H3. None of the others have. It's because they don't bind to cells in the upper respiratory tract. So therefore, they can't be transmitted. I have a friend named Maurice Hilleman, who I think is the father of modern vaccines, and he was dying actually between 2004 and 2005. But he was a flu expert, and he said to me that he thinks influenza, H5 virus, bird flu will never cause a pandemic. And then he said, in characteristic Maurice Hilleman terms, and I will be looking down or up to see whether I was right.
Okay, this this is an interesting question. Well, I think it's interesting because I don't know a lot here. Thank you, Susan. She says, "Can I find out how good my immunity to measles is?" She had measles as a child and had the MMR vaccine at age 40. Does your immunity wear off over time?
No, you're good. The measles is a long incubation period disease. Incubation period means from the time when you're exposed to the virus to when you develop symptoms. Usually, all you need is immunological memory. If you were infected with measles as a child, as I was, I had measles, I had mumps, I had rubella, I had varicella because I was a child of the 50s. We didn't have those vaccines. So I have lifetime immunity to measles because I have immunological memory cells that are going to be with me for the rest of my life. So I'm good. You're even better. You both have both. You got naturally affected and you got the vaccine. So I think you're good.
So good. So you're a superhero. If Thor's tired, you could pitch in on the Marvel team, is how I'm interpreting that. Robin is asking, for older adults, do we need to revaccinate for polio, which for us over 60 who were very young when they were vaccinated, or I'm sorry, other vaccines we need to boost now that herd immunity is at risk?
All right, so polio is interesting. So I had a polio vaccine which came out in 1955, 1956. So that was the Jonas Salk inactivated vaccine. Then that was replaced by the Albert Sabin, which was a live weakened form of the virus that came in the early 60s. And we used that really all the way up to 2000. We eliminated polio by the year 1979, and then we continued to use the oral polio vaccine. The problem with the oral polio vaccine, and this is why we should have never used it. We should have never used the oral polio vaccine. The reason
Why do you say that?
I say that, thank you for asking. I say that because the oral polio vaccine had a critical flaw, which is that because it was a live weakened form of the virus, and because it's a so-called single-stranded RNA virus and can mutate, as many viruses can, really all viruses mutate, but this especially. So it can actually mutate back to paralytic type. So even though we eliminated polio in 1979, throughout the 1980s, throughout the 1990s, every year, 8 to 10 children would get polio from the polio vaccine. So I was actually head of the polio working group. I asked to be head of the polio working group when I came onto the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices in 1998. And my mission was to get us away from the oral polio vaccine and go back to the inactivated vaccine, because it was unconscionable that every year 8 to 10 children would be paralyzed by that vaccine when you had a safer vaccine. The inactivated polio vaccine is a safe vaccine. It's an inactivated virus. And there were countries like Scandinavian countries that eliminated polio without ever using the oral polio vaccine. So the problem is those strains that were derived from Albert Sabin's polio vaccine can cause polio, and they are in the environment. So for example, that man in Rockland County, New York in 2022, that 27-year-old man that got paralyzed by polio, he never left this country. And the type of virus he was infected with was that revertant or vaccine-derived paralytic strain. It's the outbreak in Gaza is caused by that strain.
I was
Now,
going
when
to
the
ask.
CDC did this, or they looked in Rockland County, they looked in surrounding counties, was that strain in the environment? Yes. And what I would love the CDC to do is look in wastewater in Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles, because I can tell you that strain is everywhere. Lower immunization rates enough and polio comes back. But if you got the polio vaccine in the 1950s and you got, say, 3 doses of the inactivated vaccine, you're good. If you got the full dose schedule, 3 doses of the oral polio vaccine, you're good. I do think, however, if you're in a county where this outbreak occurs again, it's probably not a bad idea to get a booster. And I fear that of all the diseases we fear, this is the one I fear the most, because I remember polio. I mean, I was in a polio ward when I was 5 years of age. I remember children in iron lungs. I remember the Sister Kenny hot pack treatments where they would take these children and give these excruciatingly hot packs on withered arms and legs, because this Australian nurse thought that mattered. It's interesting. You saw Mitch McConnell, right? The minute there was a question about pulling that vaccine or backing off that vaccine, he was a polio survivor, Mitch McConnell. And Donald Trump immediately said, no, not that vaccine, right? Because he was born in 1946. He was born 10 years before that vaccine. He remembers polio.
Okay, so for those of us who do not, Gen X and down, who have not surfed YouTube to see what it looks like, how did it affect children? What were the symptoms? What was how many people did it kill? What was the recovery rate? Like what did that look like on the ground? Why were people so frightened?
So it's really a mild summer intestinal virus. Most people get infected with it and survive. Only
Okay,
about 1 in 200 people who are infected with polio will be paralyzed by it. So when you
that's a
see that
lot.
man in Rockland County who is paralyzed, know that he's the tip of a much bigger iceberg, because only 1 in 200 people who are infected will be paralyzed. So there are many more people around him who are being infected who weren't paralyzed. It can also infect the brain. It mostly infects the spinal cord and causes muscle
Okay.
weakness. It causes paralysis. If it paralyzes the muscles of respiration and you can't breathe, then you end up in something like an iron lung. It
Okay.
is tragic. I mean, and these kids are perfectly healthy, and then they're felled by this virus. It's really the birth of summer camps. The birth of summer camps in like Maine and New Hampshire was to get kids out of the city because of fear of polio. It's a summer virus,
Okay.
a summer plague, if you will.
And no one thought that putting kids all together in summer camp would just spur that?
Well, it didn't always work. My father actually went to a camp in New York called Camp Idlewild, and there was a polio outbreak, and there were several children were paralyzed in that camp. And he woke up one morning, and they'd go out to play, revelry or taps or whatever, and revelry, I guess. And the camp director had hung himself.
Oh my
Polio.
God.
You don't want to relive polio.
Okay. Wow. See, that is a horror story that is not it's not real. It's history for us, but we
Hope
are playing.
so.
Yeah, I hope so, because we are playing with fire. Um, Thank you, Robin, for that question. Um, I'm not sure I understand this question, Robert. Is there anything RFK is proposing or will focus on positive?
Yeah, it's so RFK Jr. Talks about how we could eat better. I completely agree. that we shouldn't have these things like, you know, red food dye or yellow food dye. Sure, I'm all for that. I think we can eat healthier, eat less processed foods. I'm all for that. But
Okay.
this is not the guy you want to do it because he's a science denialist. He just if the science doesn't fit into his biases, then he's going to reject it. Also, I mean, he made a big deal of Fruit Loops, you know, that it contains, you know, red food dye and yellow food dye. And I'm just thinking, do people eat Fruit Loops like for nutrition? I mean, doesn't the fact that the word fruit is spelled F-R-O-O-T, like make you wonder whether it's really, you know, fruit?
Um, as a former child Fruit Loops eater, the whole goal was to put it in the milk and let it turn the milk a color, you know, which is clearly a childhood thing. My parents fell down on the job there. But yeah, I'm not sure if I saw, this might have been an interview I saw that you had done, um, where there is a difference between the processed food here in the United States and processed food. The first time I went to Europe, I'm like, why does this taste different? It's the same food, maybe even it looks like the same potato chips, but they didn't taste the same. Um, why is the United States so far behind that? I know that's a side question, and that is perhaps a positive. Why are we behind our national peers?
No, it's a reasonable criticism. I think we can do better. I think he's right that we can do better. My only point, and I tried to make it in Congress yesterday, is he is not that guy. You don't want an anti-vaccine conspiracy theory laden and a science denialist in a position to head three major scientific agencies. I just he's scared. He's right, and see that's in part why he's able to convince people because he knows he's appealing to something that's true. I mean, we do. Um, we are sicker in many ways. We can be less. We can be more healthy. This whole "Make America Healthy Again" thing that definitely has
Mm.
resonance, but not him. Please, please, not
No.
him.
And yet I vaguely recall Michelle Obama being mocked for her let's get kids healthy push, but you know, don't go by me. I hold grudges and I'm bitter. Um, Mary wants to know, I'm not going to go, she has several questions here, but I want to dig into this middle one. Do you still agree with the shutdown of schools? Like, I mean, I, I'm going to say during the pandemic, I think people were scrambling and doing what they thought was the best. And to go back and Monday morning quarterback that is can be risky. But you know, the question is, do you, you know, if we're spitballing here, do you think that schools, do you agree that schools should have been shut down during the pandemic?
I do initially. I mean, so this is a virus that killed about 1,600 children. When the virus first hit in 2020, and you didn't have anything, you didn't have vaccines, antivirals, or monoclonals.
Mm.
Our hospital was flooded with patients. We had 3 floors of COVID, and COVID also is something we haven't really seen since, at least when it initially came into the U.S. and affected children. It caused something called multi-system inflammatory disease, which I'd never seen before. It was the child would get a relatively mild infection, sometimes an asymptomatic infection, be fine. A few weeks later, we come back to the hospital with severe lung, liver, heart disease, often end up in the ICU and occasionally die. I mean, so that's where we were in 2020. And so I think that's fine then. I do think we closed schools for way too long. And part of it was both the American Academy of Pediatrics, initially the Trump administration initially didn't want to close schools for that long. They didn't,
Right.
but it was the teachers union, really. I mean, these were older people who
Oh,
felt that they were at greater risk. And also, you know, some children live in, many children live in what's the word?
generational homes. Yeah.
Generation, multi-generational homes. So I think, as you said, Leanne, it's always easy in retrospect. And I definitely think we did close schools and businesses for too long, but we were learning. And apparently we're not allowed to learn as we go anymore.
It's yeah. You know, we've gotten so good at so many things that we think we're going to be good at everything right out the gate. We have this maybe an arrogance on, if I'm not being charitable, or this confidence in our abilities. And Mary also offered, and I think that was for me. She goes, by the way, measles encephalitis is the terrible part of contracting measles, especially
She's
adults.
right. Every year in this country, before as a veteran of natural measles infection, every year in this country before there was a measles vaccine, 1,000 children would get encephalitis or brain swelling from measles, and 250 of those 1,000 would be left with permanent brain damage. Thank you, Mary. You're exactly right.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. I love can I just take a moment and say I love the audience that we get. You folks are just so smart and wonderful. And I didn't know we were going to get a strip show. Thanks,
You know,
Dr.
this is the only thing I'm going to take off. I promise.
Oh, okay. Listen. Everything should be, to your liking, sir. Um, Irene, okay, I'm reading this. Oh Lord, now this hits a little closer to my generation. Can you get chickenpox more than once in your lifetime? And what is the relationship between chickenpox and shingles? Apparently, it's a direct line.
Right. Generally, no. Chicken pox is like measles or German measles or smallpox or polio. It's so-called long incubation period disease, which means all you need is immunological memory to protect you for a very long period of time. So for the most part, no. But the thing is, chicken pox, it's in the herpes virus group. And so when you're infected with chicken pox, that virus then lives latently or silently in your nervous system. And as you get older, and you become less immunologically competent, or you're getting chemotherapy for your cancer, or you're getting immune suppressive therapy for your rheumatologic diseases, that virus can reactivate and cause shingles, which is one of the most painful pains of man. I mean, it's right up there, humankind, with labor and delivery, with chronic back pain, with corneal abrasions. I mean, that is one bad pain. And so we do have a vaccine for that. So people
Mhm.
who were naturally infected with chickenpox, which is basically anybody who was born before 1995. I mean, that's when that
Mm,
vaccine was first
yeah,
licensed. Certainly can benefit from a shingles vaccine when they reach a certain age.
yeah. I had chicken pox when I was a kid, and several years ago, this is many years ago now, I went on a commercial audition for what was then a very new shingles vaccine. And I'm reading the copy in the waiting room with other people. They've either had it or knew someone who had it, and they're talking about the side effects. I go in, I'm terrified. I do the audition, and I forget what question the casting director asked me. I said, "Well, listen, I'm sold already just from the copy." I literally left that day and called my doctor and made an appointment. And he's like, "You're too young." I'm like, "I don't care. When is the soonest I can get this thing?" Because it was pretty scary. And yes, I've heard that that is one of the pains that you don't want that. Nor, but I hold it in my back pocket to wish it on my enemies. Can I do that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Can we as citizens, thank you, Jonathan, for this question. Um, can we as citizens, what can we as citizens do if RFK is confirmed into his role? And I'm going to add, besides get a passport and leave. What what can we as citizens do? Is there anything that we can do if he
No, I
gets?
think so. I had to speak in Congress yesterday, and what struck me was the one of the senator's aides said that when this RFK Jr. issue came up, that they were flooded with emails and letters, and they respond to that. They do.
Okay.
I mean, they're there to be voted in again and again and again. They are the wedded finger to the wind crowd. You like to think they're always just doing the right thing, but they want to do the thing that makes sure they get reelected. So the voter matters, and I do think that because I think most parents I think value vaccines, and there's this tremendous warrior force out there of parents that should RFK Jr. do what I am sure he's going to do if he's confirmed next week, is that he will do everything he can to make vaccines either more expensive or less available. And so I think we need to rise up, and that's how we do it. It's because it's ultimately a political process.
Okay, so are you saying that these confirmation hearings are just a show that he's going to get it?
No, I'm not. I think so. My sense from this being on the Hill yesterday was that it's likely he'll get it. It's sort of like 2-1 in favor of his getting it, but it's not a slam dunk. There are a lot of people who are worried about it. Sometimes, because he's, pro-choice. There's a lot that certainly there are Republicans that don't like that. He also has some real ethical problems. I mean, he's sort of in the midst of like suing Merck for HPV vaccine, and were he to, in any sense be successful at that, he would, he gets like 10% of any referral to another personal injury lawyer. He sued HHS for various things. I mean, it's the agency he'll head, which, is these things are all major conflicts of interest. Not that conflicts of interest matter anymore, but there
Yeah,
was
I
a
was about to say
time.
that doesn't seem like a thing.
Yeah.
I think the decent people of the world are still, saying, "Hey, this is where the teaspoon goes," and the barbarians are at the gate busting through the door. Uh, okay. This is a very specific question. Thank you, George. If RFK Jr. is confirmed, would he have the ability to halt vaccines in any government-run agency, for example, the Veterans Administration?
What he would do, he would say this hasn't been studied enough. There wasn't the right kind of placebo-controlled trial. It wasn't tested for long enough. They didn't look for this particular or that particular side effect. I think he could throw a wrench into the system that would make it very hard to get vaccines. And that is his passion. That's what he wants to do.
Oh, Lord. Um, Any thoughts? Thank you, Arthur. Any thoughts about the efficacy of campaigns to scotch his nomination? And by the way, you had me at the word scotch. Thank you very much. I almost misread this question. And Arthur says he knows this isn't your bailiwick, but do you think there are enough wavering senators to stop him? And if he stopped, what do you think of I can't pronounce Baccaria. I'm
Becerra, yeah.
Becerra. Thank
Javier
you.
Becerra.
Thank you. And McCary and Wilden are still like that is a question I was going to ask you. If not RFK Jr., then who? But but initially, what are your thoughts about campaigns to end the nomination? Are there enough wavering senators?
So there have to be at least 3 Republicans who would vote no, and that means that all the Democrats also vote no. And there are some wavering Democrats. Fetterman, apparently, in Pennsylvania, is a wavering Democrat. Cory Booker, people have said, may be wavering on this because he's so taken by the food stuff. And
Oh,
so, I mean,
you know what? Let me text Cory because
do me a favor, could you convince him not to vote yet?
oh, wow. Okay. The food stuff is not enough.
No, it's fine. I think the food stuff's an important thing. I think making
No, agree. Yeah.
healthy again is important. I think we should diet more. I think we should exercise more. I think we should eat the right foods. I agree with all that. He's not the guy. And if it's not him, it will be somebody else, presumably who's also picked for their loyalty and not necessarily their competence. But it can't possibly be as bad as him. He's a warrior in this for 20 years. He means it. So I'll take anybody else.
Okay. Steffi, well, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it. Will the drug companies stop producing vaccines because of vaccine bans?
That's a great question. I think this is a fragile industry. I don't think people see just how fragile this industry is. Vaccines are only something you give once or a few times in a lifetime. They're never going to compete with things like lipid lowering agents, diabetes drugs, neurological drugs, lifestyle products. Anything that you take every day those are much, much, much bigger money makers for these companies than not. And so in the early 80s, when the notion that the wholesale pertussis or whooping cough vaccine caused permanent brain damage, which it didn't, but nonetheless, it was born and there was lawsuit after lawsuit. Ultimately, by the mid 80s, over $3.2 billion in lawsuits in the mid 80s. And so companies just left the market. There were 18 companies that made vaccines in 1980. By the end of the decade, there were 4, and that's how easily they can drop it. So it's a fragile market, and it's sort of a fragile in part because we don't fear these diseases anymore. And because we don't fear these diseases, we're much more susceptible to these vaccine safety issues, real or imagined, that enables us to eliminate. It's not just that we've largely eliminated measles. We've eliminated the memory of measles. People don't remember how sick that virus can make you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm one of those people. I didn't live with it. So that's why I'm asking or have asked. But yes, we have lost that fear. We've almost gotten too big for our britches. That's not the right analogy, but you know what I'm saying. Stuart, hi Stuart. Oh, you've been a guest on the show. Nice to see you in the comments. If RFK Jr. Changes the CDC recommendations for vaccines or medications for various conditions, will that filter down to us and change what our doctors recommend and change the availability to the medicine? Will some other group, AMA, World Health Organization, provide more evidence based on guidance? Are you asking for evidence in this administration, sir? Like, I'm sorry, but yeah, how long will something like that take to filter down?
So the way the process typically works is, so the FDA is a regulatory agency. They would say license the product, but they don't recommend it. It's the CDC that's the recommending body, and the insurance companies wait. once the CDC recommends it, and usually that then appears in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, their journal, that's when the insurance companies then step in to cover it. And that's when the Vaccine for Children's program, which pays for like half of all vaccines, then supports it. That has to happen. And if the CDC, for example, say, look, we recommend this, but RFK Jr. would be the boss of whoever the CDC director is. Let's say it's Dave Weldon. He could say, I don't think this has been studied enough. I don't think we studied the right things. I don't think we had the right groups. So I'm not going to recommend this. And then it's not covered by insurance, and it's not covered by the Vaccine for Children's program. So then doctors aren't going to give it because they wait for the CDC to see what's happening.
Would this then become a matter of wealth and class, and wealthy people would go, okay, yeah, it's not covered, I'll pay for it?
Yeah, I'll go to Canada and get it, bring it back. I mean, that what you
So
mean?
more medical
I
tourism,
think the
perhaps?
companies would leave. I think there's only 4 companies that make vaccines for America's children. Don't screw around with this, or you'll lose these vaccines. They can drop it. They can. They have many other bigger products.
Well, this leads to Laura's question. How have pharmaceutical companies, especially the ones who manufacture vaccines, been reacting to RFK's anti-vaccine stance? Will they have any influence on the confirmation decision?
I just talked to one person in the industry recently, and her response was, "We are just waiting to see what happens." That's what she said, and I think it's in part because what I said earlier: vaccines are not a big thing for them.
I want to say, but these
It's
people are
not. I
taking
mean,
it in the
attack
public.
lipid lowering agents. Do that, and then they'll be all over this.
Do our children have so little value? I'm sorry. That was
No,
an
no, I
internal
agree.
thought.
Look, I agree with you. I think many of these companies do make vaccines for all the right reasons. I do. I mean, I believe that's true. I'm just saying it's a fragile industry, so don't screw around with it.
Okay. Um, huh. I don't know if this is, well, no, this is in your wheelhouse. Some countries do not include the hepatitis B vaccine as part of the childhood vaccine schedule. What are the reasons for including it in our childhood vaccine schedule?
Because we can and we can afford it. I mean, before there was
Ooh.
the hepatitis B vaccine. So the hepatitis B vaccine, the original hepatitis B vaccine, the so-called plasma-derived vaccine, was introduced in 1981, and it was really just recommended for high-risk groups, drug users, men who had sex with men, et cetera. By the early 90s, we had a recombinant DNA vaccine, so single protein vaccine, the Recombivacin and Engerix. And it was recommended in 1991 for all newborns. And here's why. At that time, there were roughly 18,000 cases a year of hepatitis B in children less than 10. Half of them would get it by passing through a birth canal that was contaminated with hepatitis B because the mother had hepatitis B, but the other half didn't get it that way. They got it from relatively casual contact from someone who had hepatitis B, but generally didn't know it. It's the so-called silent epidemic, right? Hepatitis
Wow.
B. So when we introduced that in 1991, now we've essentially eliminated hepatitis B in young children. It's great, but I think if you're infected with hepatitis B in the first few months of life, you have a very high chance, about a 90% chance of going on to develop chronic liver disease, meaning cirrhosis, or liver cancer. That's why it's important to vaccinate as a newborn vaccine, or at least as an early vaccine, because the stakes are so high. And although mothers generally are tested for hepatitis B, first of all, no test is perfect. Secondly, you can acquire the virus even after you've been tested. So I think that's why you sort of jump with the net by getting that newborn vaccine. I mean, my children both got their newborn vaccine. It's hard to watch. It is hard to watch your child get a shot. It's like that first scratch in a new car.
Yeah, I vividly remember my mother taking me in for some shot or another, and I must have been about 3 or 4. And my mother had also taught me that if someone offered me something and I didn't want it, all I had to do was say no, thank you. So I remember sitting in the doctor's office with my mother on her lap, and they approached me with the needle, and I said, "Oh, no, no, thank you."
Did that work?
No, it did not. Not at all. Let's see. I have a note here that I'm going to read, but I want to ask you this question. Thank you, Kay. Will medical schools train students and new physicians on how to recognize these once rare diseases like measles, mumps, and rubella?
That is a great question. And
I thought
this
so.
scares me a lot. I'll give you an example. So I trained in the late 1970s. Between 77 and 80 is when I trained in pediatrics. I was a resident and intern at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh in the late 70s. When I was on in the emergency department rotation, I would do 2 to 3 spinal taps a night. I would, because we didn't have a meningococcal vaccine for children. We didn't have a pneumococcal vaccine for children. We didn't have a Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine for children, all of which can cause meningitis. So I was very good at doing spinal taps, as were all of my fellow residents. Today, pediatric residents at my hospital, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, can't do spinal caps. They can't. So when somebody comes in and there's a question of bacterial meningitis, the interventional radiologist does the spinal tap. That's number one. Two is we had a recent measles outbreak in Philadelphia. And they brought a couple kids into the hospital. Typically, you're hospitalized with measles because you're severely dehydrated and need intravenous fluids, or you have pneumonia and you need oxygen or respiratory support. That's what gets you into the hospital. And that's all. I mean, if you don't need respiratory support or you don't need intravenous fluids, don't bring that child into the hospital. You don't want measles in the hospital. It's a highly contagious disease, and you're bringing it into an environment where there are a lot of children who are immune suppressed who are not going to handle that virus well. And we brought a couple kids into the hospital. I'm looking at these young doctors saying, "What are you doing? This is not the child you want to bring into the hospital." Oh, and I'll give you one more example. We're getting to the end time, but there's this bacteria, Haemophilus influenza B. Okay, so that bacteria, which was the bane of my residency, caused 20 to 25,000 cases of meningitis, sepsis, pneumonia every year. But it also caused something else called epiglottitis, which is a swelling of the epiglottis, which is this membrane that sits on top of your trachea. It was a frightening disease because when they came in, those children came in, if they got upset, or they had like a spasm of that epiglottis, it could occlude their airway and they would suffocate and die. So when they came in with a question of epiglottitis, we would bring them into this little dark room where we had an aquarium, and they would just sit quietly while people came down from the operating room and brought them quietly up to the operating room where they could put in a tube, that would bypass the epiglottis. Because if it spasmed, you had to do a tracheostomy. So there was a child this was when more recently, that had Haemophilus influenza B from another hospital and had epiglottitis, and they transported the child by ambulance to our hospital. What are you doing? I mean, if that child spasms in the ambulance, you can't do a tracheostomy. He's going to die. I mean, the way we would always do it then, back in the 70s, is you would travel by helicopter or ambulance, whatever, to that hospital, bringing an anesthesiologist with you, bringing a surgeon with you to be, or an ENT surgeon with you to do it there. You don't travel, by ambulance. So then you're right. It scares me that how much we don't know, how much we couldn't recognize polio, frankly.
Wow, this is very scary indeed. How much experience is lost, like you said, because we lost the fear, we lost experience, and this is going to have repercussions all the way through. I know we are getting close to the top of the hour, and I don't want to not mention this. Barry Carr, the fearless leader of us all, wants me to mention and let folks know that if you go to the centerinquiry.org/alerts, that there was a whole piece that CFI wrote to oppose the nomination of RFK Jr. So CFI has been on this, as we say around these parts, from the jump. So once again, folks, that's the centerinquiry.org and alerts. And there are actually, if I recall, several pieces that CFI wrote in response to this guy's terrible. Don't do this. Tom, is it? No, that's not the question I wanted to go to. Oh, as a traveler, this is really, really good. Thank you, Anthony. Could vaccine restrictions or lead to challenges with travel to other countries?
Yeah, yes. It's interesting that when the Trump administration recently said that the public health agencies like the CDC or FDA or NIH cannot issue any public statements, they sort of have muted them now.
Yeah.
What you feel like saying is that when somebody comes into your office and says, what travel vaccine should I get for one region or another? That's what the CDC and the WHO let you know. They let you know exactly what is where. And if you don't know that, what can you say? I don't know. I am not getting the information I need. So it is a frightening time. It is. I just feel we're moving into this post-truth, anti-science world. And believe me, we will not benefit from that.
No, Not at all. I would say get your passports ready, but if you can't use them, uh, Doctor, thank you so much for always making time for us. What is this, your fourth or fifth merry-go-round with us?
You should be getting
You
tired of me at this point.
no, man, not at all. You are our number one guest around here, absolute friend of the show. Barry is interjecting here. Thank you, Barry. Tell your senators to oppose the nomination of RFK Jr. because, as you said, Dr. Paul, they get those letters, they get that, and that does have an effect. But again, thank you for being here. Thank you, Center for Inquiry, Skeptical Inquirer, for having this. And my name is Leanne Lord. I thank you all for being here. And yes, we are into the breach. So everybody, good night and good luck.
Good night,
Thanks,
Lee.
Doc.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too.